Should prisoners have access to voluntary assisted dying measures? That is the question that the Australian media have been asking as an elderly, terminally ill bank robber is given his jail sentence this week. Now, the media apparently thought people would be uproared about this, and they really tried to get an outcry, but so far the Australian people haven't really taken the bait, which has been amusing. However, I decided to look a bit further into the topic and the ethical, moral and legal dilemmas that it may raise. Before we begin, we post death and dying related videos every Friday, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk prisoners and voluntary assisted dying. So let's look at this week's case. Kim Parsons, 73, robbed 11 banks in the Australian state of South Australia from 2004 to 2014, armed with a rifle and wearing a balaclava. He was dubbed the Bicycle Bandit after using a push bike to flee many of the scenes. Reports said he evaded capture for years until the police arrested him in October 2023, which means it took the police 10 years to catch him since his last heist in 2014. But he committed his first heist in 2004, so 20 years the cops have supposedly been looking for this guy. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So originally he pleaded not guilty to 10 counts of aggravated robbery and firearms charges before admitting to his crime spree in June 17th this year. Now at the time of pleading guilty, he had just weeks left to live anyway as cancer corroded his bones and brain. He had been granted permission for voluntary assisted dying before his guilty plea and sentence, though reports don't say how far in advance it was. All information about a person's access to voluntary assisted dying is confidential in Australia, which the media knows and chose to run with the story anyway. They also made multiple references to voluntary assisted dying being controversial, etc., when they know damn well that the vast majority of Australians agree with it. It must have been a very slow news week. Anyways, Parsons pleaded guilty, was sentenced to 35 years and shuffled off to prison. 2 days later, surrounded by family, he died using VAD procedures. So that was last week. My thoughts on the case. So that was the case. Keep in mind that he only had weeks left to live anyway. It's not like he was perfectly healthy and wanting to take himself out so as not to do his prison time. He still had to meet all the eligibility criteria that anyone else would, and as the media grumbled, there is no prohibition on prisoners accessing the procedure. Now, reports are saying the victims of the heist are upset that he won't spend any time in prison, and I completely understand that. It doesn't feel like there's any justice here. But even if he hadn't accessed VAD, he would have been kept in the prison's medical wing for 2 weeks tops before the cancer killed him. Which brings me back to the police investigation. Now, I'm not saying that police investigations aren't difficult, but all up, it took 20 years for them to arrest him. If he had been caught even 10 years earlier, he wouldn't have had the cancer and would have sat in prison for a while. And with that in mind, let's look at a different case, which also happens to be from South Australia. Case 2. In June 2022, Malcolm Day, then 80 years old, was sentenced to 20 years for abusing 2 students in the 1980s when he was a music teacher. Like many, unfortunately, back in the 80s, the children weren't believed at the time, but bravely came forward as adults. A bit over a year after Day was sentenced in August 2023, he was granted voluntary assisted dying permit after being diagnosed with a terminal illness believed to be terminal cancer. He was the first Australian prisoner to have asked for and received this, though bearing in mind voluntary assisted dying has only been legal in Australia for a few years now. Now, of course, what he did was horrendous. No one is debating that. And he absolutely should be punished. No one is debating that either. But let me play devil's advocate for a second. Keeping a prisoner in jail long term is expensive for the taxpayer. Keeping an unhealthy 80-year-old prisoner is even more expensive. So it would cost the taxpayer significantly less if he just moved himself on to the afterlife. And judging by how these types of criminals are usually handled in prison, we can imagine that the last year or so of his life wasn't very pleasant, or at least we can hope. Also, many people feel sex offenders should be executed, but we don't have that here in Australia, so perhaps these people would be happy about it. But aside from all of that, if people had bothered to listen to these children when they first told what had happened, whether it be the police or whoever else they told, he would have spent decades in prison before this point getting the crap beaten out of him by other inmates. But they didn't listen, and here we are. I don't think this is really a question of whether VAD should be accessible to prisoners. They still need to be terminally ill and meet all the eligibility criteria just like anybody else. This is more of a questioning as to why it takes so damn long for these people to be arrested that they are sick old dying men by that time. I think the media knows they can't run with that angle. It would upset too many of the higher ups. It is easy for them to run with a topic like VAD that they already see as controversial and try to make it scarier by adding the term prisoner on top of it. But as for the question on whether a prisoner should have access to VAD, a while back I was watching a documentary about capital punishment in the USA. Obviously not the same theme as this. But the narrator said something that has stuck with me ever since. And that is that a country is only as humane or as ethical as its prison system. Think about it. Which is why I say, along with many others in the death field, that yes, terminally ill prisoners should have the same access to VAD as the general public. Withholding it out of revenge just makes the government just as bad as they are, and you can't have a moral standing if you stoop that low. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. And with that, go talk death.